There was a time when you could walk into almost any American living room and see the same two names without even thinking about it. RCA glowing in soft blue, under the television. Polaroid sitting on the coffee table, waiting to devour another pack of film. Let me take you back to the 1970s. The TV is a heavy wooden box, the center of family life, and beneath the screen, a tiny RCA logo quietly announces who owns the night. On the table, a Polaroid SX70 is folded like a piece of futuristic origami, ready to snap open and spit out a photograph that develops in your hand while the kids crowd around and the adults pretend they're not just as amazed. Polaroid didn't just sell cameras, it invented instant gratification as a consumer habit. It created the selfie decades before that word existed, giving ordinary people the power to point a lens at their own faces, press a button, and watch their life appear on glossy paper. RCA did something just as radical in a different direction. It helped build modern broadcasting itself, from founding NBC in the 1920s to controlling the patents, the transmitters, and the TVs that turned radio waves into pictures in your living room. Not only did these companies dominate their markets, they shaped how families experienced time, memory, and entertainment. Birthdays, holidays, weddings, late-night shows, presidential speeches, all passed through Polaroid shutters and RCA screens. Their logos were stamped on the way people saw the world and on the way the world saw them. And yet, look around your living room tonight. No Polaroid on the coffee table. No RCA under the screen. Two brands that once felt immortal have been reduced to nostalgic trivia and discount rack licensing deals. How do empires that powerful, that embedded in daily life, simply evaporate from the home? It's an example of what happens when power turns inward. These companies didn't just miss the future by accident. They protected their cash cows, sued competitors, and clung to control while the ground shifted under their feet. Polaroid leaned on patents and instant film profits while digital censors crept in from the margins. RCA milked broadcast and hardware as cable, VCRs, and eventually the internet rewrote the rules of attention. Their story is one of invention that became inertia, of wealth that hardened into bureaucracy, of executives who finally had so much to lose that they treated every new technology as a threat instead of a chance to rebuild the empire. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it shows how a company can go from scrappy outsider to near monopoly, then drift into boardroom denial, internal sabotage of its own innovators, and in the end, the quiet sale of its name to whoever offers enough money. If Apple, Netflix, or any modern giant feels too permanent to fail, stay with this story. Because the night Polaroid and RCA vanished from the living room is closer to tonight than it looks. There was a time when you could walk into almost any living room and see the same quiet arrangement of power. An RCA logo glowing beneath the television, a Polaroid camera resting on the coffee table, a little stack of square photos curling at the edges. Not only did these brands dominate their markets, they choreographed family life itself. This story is at times inspiring and at times chilling. Two companies helped humans see and hear the world in ways that once felt like science fiction, then proved that even world-shaping inventions can harden into cages. The instant photo, the broadcast signal, the living room altar of TV and film all turned into habits, then into business models, then into blinders that stopped their own creators from seeing what came next. Because here is the central theme, it's an example of what happens when greed, comfort, and institutional pride go unchecked inside companies that control how we capture memories and consume culture. When executives believe the empire is permanent, they start managing for quarterly money instead of long-term survival, defending old patents instead of building new platforms, milking legacy formats while the ground quietly shifts under their feet. Polaroid's leaders were so addicted to instant film profits that over 2/3 of their revenue depended on people buying more packs of those glossy squares. RCA's executives held patents on television, owned NBC, manufactured the sets, and collected ad dollars. They did not just sell products, they owned the pipeline from lens to living room. That level of wealth and control feels invincible until it isn't. Let me take you back to the bridge between their golden age and their fall. Camcorders, VCRs, cable channels, then digital sensors, PCs, and finally the internet arrived in waves. Each wave looked small at first, a toy for hobbyists, a niche for nerds. Each wave quietly rewired how images and sound moved through the world. The companies that had taught families to gather around a TV or huddle over a fresh Polaroid print suddenly faced a new reality. The screen was leaving the living room, and the camera was leaving the camera. If that sounds familiar, it should. Today, smartphones and streaming platforms sit where Polaroid and RCA once sat, at the center of attention, on every table, in every pocket. The same patterns are visible. Platforms defending app stores and ad models, studios clinging to franchises, social networks optimizing for engagement, while younger users drift somewhere else. The details change, the rhythm doesn't. So here is the promise of this story. We will follow Polaroid and RCA from scrappy experiments to household gods, then inside the boardrooms where key decisions were made, postponed, or buried. His story is one of discipline and expansion. Their story is one of invention and denial. Together, they show how a company can be visionary in the lab and cowardly in the conference room, how a single bet on the wrong future can erase decades of dominance. And this is not just a warning for CEOs. Careers are built the same way empires are. A few early wins, a comfortable routine, a quiet refusal to update skills because the old tricks still pay. If companies this beloved and entrenched can vanish from every home, what makes anyone so sure today's platforms are permanent fixtures in life? In the next section, the founding visions of Polaroid and RCA will show exactly how fast the climb can be and how early the seeds of collapse are planted. There was a time when the story of American technology could be told through 2 living rooms. On the coffee table, a chunky little camera that spat out memories in white bordered squares. Against the wall, a glowing wooden box humming with radio waves turned into moving pictures. One was Polaroid, the other was RCA. Together, they looked permanent. They were anything but. To understand how they vanished, let me take you back to a young man wandering Harvard Yard in the late 1920s, skipping class to stare at streetlights. Edwin Land was not a polished executive. He was a restless, obsessive tinkerer who dropped out of Harvard to chase one problem: how to tame light itself. He spent nights in cramped New York labs, sleeping on benches, experimenting with crystals and plastic films, until he created cheap, practical, polarizing filters. While his friends were chasing degrees and money, he was chasing a physical phenomenon most people barely understood. His story is one of monastic focus. Land walked the streets mumbling equations, rewrote experiments over and over, and built a tiny company around a single idea: take brutal, abstract physics and put it in a product a family could hold. Polarized sunglasses, 3D movies, military rangefinders, and finally, instant photography. When a child asked why she couldn't see a photo right now, Land didn't commission a market study. He disappeared into the lab and came back with a camera that turned chemistry into a small act of magic. This was Polaroid's psychological foundation, the belief that if the product was miraculous enough, the world would rearrange itself around it. RCA began somewhere very different. Born in 1919 with the backing of the US Navy and major corporations, the Radio Corporation of America was created to control strategic wireless patents after World War I. This wasn't a lone genius in a basement. It was a quasi-national project. RCA inherited Marconi's American assets, pooled military-era patents, and then pivoted from wartime signals to peacetime entertainment. Within a decade, it was building radios, operating international links, and through NBC, turning the airwaves into a commercial empire. Where Land's world revolved around cameras in people's hands, RCA's mind lived in towers, standards, and contracts. It made receivers and transmitters, yes, but the real power sat in patent pools, spectrum allocations, and network control. Executives thought in terms of infrastructure and regulation, not in terms of a single enchanted object on a kitchen table. Both origin stories were soaked in uncertainty. Polaroid, in its early years, survived on thin military contracts and niche industrial uses, never fully sure if the glamorous consumer dream would arrive before the cash ran out. RCA, for all its backing, had to navigate post-war regulation, skeptical legislators, and rival corporations arguing over who owned the future of radio. Neither path was guaranteed. Both felt precarious. Yet those early pressures hardened into habits. Polaroid learned to trust the lone visionary and the breakthrough product. RCA learned to trust the fortress, patents, standards, and political leverage. It's an example of what happens when early survival strategies become permanent identities. Later, when digital imaging, cable, and new networks arrived, those identities would turn from strengths into blind spots. In the next section, that slow turn from vision to vulnerability begins. Those blind spots didn't appear overnight. They were built scene by scene from moments that felt like miracles. Let me take you back to a winter afternoon in 1943, when a father on vacation in Santa Fe pointed a camera at his little girl. He clicked the shutter, promised a picture, and then heard the question that would rewrite his life and his company. Why can't I see it now? Most parents would laugh it off, explain the lab, the chemicals, the weight. Edwin Land froze. In that simple complaint, he heard an attack on delay itself. There was a time when photography meant patience, dark rooms, and envelopes of prints arriving days later. Land walked the streets that day doing equations in his head, sketching optics and chemistry from memory, turning a child's impatience into an obsession, a complete camera and film system that could pull an image out of nowhere in minutes. The years that followed were not glamorous. Engineers burned through failed emulsions, warped rollers, and film packs that jammed, bubbled, or peeled apart in the user's hands. Land pushed anyway, chasing a product that would feel less like a machine and more like a magic trick. Click. Whir. Then that slow, ghostly bloom on a square of paper, as faces emerged from gray fog into full color right in your palm. When the SX70 arrived in 1972, a sleek folding camera that hid its complexity inside leather and chrome, even master photographers like Ansel Adams called it a dream. For ordinary families, it felt like holding power that used to belong only to labs. But the real genius was not just optical, it was financial. Polaroid quietly built a razor and blade empire. Cameras priced low enough to sit on kitchen counters, locked to high-margin, proprietary film packs that had to be replaced again and again. Every birthday, every road trip, every blurry party snapshot meant more money flowing back to the factory. By the late 1970s, over 2/3 of Polaroid's revenue came from instant film alone. Each memory was a tiny annuity. This was the psychological hook. Polaroid didn't just sell cameras, it sold the feeling of getting what you wanted now. No driving to a lab, no waiting a week, no wondering if the shot came out. At a party, the camera became a social ritual. Someone posed, the shutter snapped, the print slid out, and a small crowd gathered to watch the image appear, shaking the photo even though it didn't help. The picture could be handed across the room within minutes, pinned to a fridge, slipped into a wallet, or, with a bit of ruthless teenage timing, used as proof that something really happened. His story is one of brilliant alignment between technology, emotion, and money, at times inspiring and at times chilling. Because the same dependence on film that made Polaroid wildly profitable also welded its identity to chemistry and paper. When digital sensors arrived, offering instant images with no consumables, they weren't just a new format. They were a direct attack on Polaroid's soul and its balance sheet. In the next section, that beautiful trap will start to close. That beautiful trap was not unique to Polaroid. There was a time when another American giant was building a different kind of addiction, not with chemistry and paper, but with invisible waves and glowing glass. RCA wasn't just selling gadgets. It was quietly wiring itself into the daily life of almost every family with electricity. Let me take you back to the early 1920s. Radio was still a noisy experiment, a tangle of patents, military gear, and hobbyists with headphones. RCA began as a patent holding company, a legal warehouse for radio technology assembled after World War I. But very quickly, its leaders realized a brutal truth. Owning the pipes meant nothing if no one cared what flowed through them. So in 1926, RCA created NBC, the national broadcasting company, not as a side project, but as a way to flood those airwaves with must-hear shows, music, comedy, and news. Because it controlled both the patents and the programs, RCA could do something dangerous and powerful. It turned radio from a gadget into a habit. Listeners rearranged evenings around sponsored dramas and live concerts. Money flowed from advertisers into NBC, from NBC into transmitters and studios, and from the excitement on air into sales of RCA branded radios. It's an example of what happens when a company stops thinking in products and starts thinking in empires. After World War II, RCA saw the next screen coming. Television was still fragile, expensive, and unreliable, but the company moved fast. It poured money into research labs, refined picture tubes and color standards, lobbied Washington over broadcast rules, and fought to have its technical choices written into the DNA of American TV. At the same time, it cranked out television sets on assembly lines, then used NBC to show viewers what they were missing if they didn't upgrade the living room. By the 1950s and 60s, that strategy had hardened into a vertically integrated empire. RCA owned key broadcast patents, owned NBC to create the shows, and sold the televisions that brought those shows into the home. Not only did it profit at every step of the chain, it made each step reinforce the others, creating a loop of technology, content, and money that looked unbreakable. The cultural impact was enormous. Families gathered around RCA sets to watch the moon landing, to see Kennedy and Nixon face off in televised debates, to share primetime comedies and variety hours that defined American life. The TV cabinet became a domestic altar, and for millions, the little logo on the front might as well have spelled modern. RCA was no longer just a company. In many homes, it was the frame through which reality appeared. Yet, hidden inside that success was a quiet weakness. A company trained to own everything, control everything, and defend everything would soon meet formats it did not invent. VCRs, cable, home video. And when control is the goal, What happens when the future refuses to be controlled? There was a time when executives at Polaroid and RCA didn't just feel successful, they felt permanent. The logos in the living room were their daily proof. Every instant photo on the fridge, every glowing RCA set in the corner whispered the same comforting lie: this empire will last. Inside Polaroid's headquarters, that near monopoly on instant photography became a kind of religion. The SX70 had stunned the world. Film sales poured in, and 2/3 of the company's money came from those little chemical rectangles. When every birthday, wedding, and family vacation depends on your product, it becomes hard to imagine a life where people might not wait for film to develop at all. Why would anyone abandon the magic of watching an image slowly appear, when for a generation that experience felt at times inspiring and at times chilling in its intimacy? RCA lived in a similar hallucination. It didn't just make televisions, it helped invent the broadcast system those televisions relied on. It owned patents, factories, and NBC itself. When a company controls the hardware, the signal, and the shows, the psychology of dominance kicks in. The living room becomes a private kingdom. Viewers tune in, advertisers pay up, regulators negotiate. But in the executive suite, the conclusion feels obvious. If everyone already comes to you for reality, where else could they possibly go? Yet, while the outside world saw glamour and innovation, the inside slowly thickened. At Polaroid, the daring bets of Edwin Land's early life gave way to layers of vice presidents, planning committees, and executive reviews. New ideas were filtered, softened, and delayed until they no longer threatened the instant film cash cow. Digital imaging research existed, but it lived in side labs, far from the boardroom where quarterly film numbers were treated as sacred. RCA followed the same script. The company that once gambled on radio and television now filled floors with middle management, memos, and meetings. Engineers who had once chased wild concepts found themselves presenting to risk-averse committees that optimized color standards, negotiated licensing fees, and defended old formats. The external image stayed glossy. Cutting-edge TVs, prestigious network shows, a brand that still sounded like the future. Internally, the mission had quietly shifted from conquering the unknown to preserving what had already been conquered. Let me take you back to the moment this became fatal. While Polaroid was perfecting film chemistry and RCA was polishing broadcast schedules, small teams in Japan were shrinking camcorders, experimenting with VCRs, and wiring homes with cable. In obscure Silicon Valley labs, early digital sensors and computer graphics hinted at images that needed no film, no fixed broadcast time, no single dominant gatekeeper. It's an example of what happens when power turns inward. The giants optimize their empires, the outsiders redesign the map. And when the map changes, the old living room gods discover that loyalty, like technology, can vanish almost overnight. But inside Polaroid's own walls, another map was already being drawn. Hidden behind the glossy ads and the humming film plants, engineers were quietly building a future that did not need film at all. Let me take you back to the early 1980s. There was a time when digital imaging sounded like science fiction, yet in a corner of Polaroid's labs, teams were wiring up charge-coupled sensors, crude LCDs, and bulky memory modules. They were feeding live images onto screens, freezing them without a single grain of silver halide. On paper, this was heresy. In the lab, it was exhilarating. Internal prototypes began to appear. Brick-sized cameras that captured an image electronically, tethered to terminals that could display, edit, even transmit a picture without a darkroom. Engineers hacked together hybrids that snapped a scene, showed it on a monitor, and only then decided whether to print. It was clunky, expensive, and slow. It was also a direct shot at the company's own empire of plastic cartridges and chemical pods. His story is one of engineers who saw the cliff before the executives did. Many had grown up in a world where instant film meant power, money, and near-religious customer loyalty, yet they were now watching microprocessors get cheaper every quarter. They knew that if an image could live as data, it could be copied infinitely, shared instantly, and printed only when needed. That future was at times inspiring and at times chilling because it did not obviously include selling millions of film packs a year. Finance and marketing did the math. 2/3 of Polaroid's revenue came from instant film, with fat margins that kept the company's life comfortable and its shareholders happy. Any serious move into digital meant cannibalizing that cash machine, so the spreadsheets won. Digital projects were funded just enough to claim the company was exploring the space, then quietly sidelined when they threatened film volumes. Inside meeting rooms, the cultural clash became routine. On one side, visionary engineers talked about sensors, pixels, and screens. On the other, executives trained on film throughput and chemical yields talked about plant utilization and cartridge mix. One group spoke in bits, the other in gallons. Guess which language the board understood? It's an example of what happens when a company's past success trains its leaders to fear their own future. Polaroid did launch a few digital curiosities, but they were neutered, overpriced, and always framed as accessories to film, never as its replacement. The message was clear. Innovation could live here, as long as it never touched the real money. Then came a pattern break that seemed to prove the executives right. In the early 1990s, after a brutal courtroom battle, Polaroid won a massive judgment against Kodak for infringing its instant photography patents. Hundreds of millions flowed in. The old model, the film empire, looked vindicated. Yet while the company celebrated its legal victory, a quieter revolution was gathering outside the courthouse, one that would make that triumph look strangely hollow. That quieter revolution wasn't happening in dark rooms or courtrooms. It was happening in living rooms, on a little spinning reel of tape that would quietly rip open the old broadcast order. There was a time when television meant one thing. You watched what the network served, when they served it, on the glowing box in the corner. RCA had helped build that world. It owned patents, it owned NBC, it sold the TV sets themselves. Money flowed through the airwaves it controlled. But in the 1970s, videotape and the home VCR began to whisper a different promise. You don't have to live on the network's schedule anymore. Let me take you back to those early machines. They were bulky, expensive, a little unreliable. Yet suddenly, a family could record a favorite show, rent a movie, pause for dinner, rewind a scene. Time, which had always belonged to the broadcaster, now belonged to the viewer. Japanese firms like JVC and Sony saw the opening and rushed in, iterating on designs, improving picture quality, slashing prices, flooding stores with models that got cheaper and easier every year. RCA's response revealed how tightly it clung to its old empire. The company did make VCRs, often through partnerships, but its real instinct was defensive. Protect the broadcast networks, protect the TV set business, protect the flow of advertising money that came from millions of synchronized eyeballs. A machine that let people skip commercials, fast forward through carefully scheduled programming, and rent movies that never touched an NBC transmitter? That looked less like the future and more like a threat. So while Japanese competitors treated the VCR as a beachhead into the home. RCA treated it as an accessory to the television. Others fought a ruthless price war, optimized manufacturing, and built global brands around videotape. RCA moved slower, charged more, and watched as its name slipped from the front of the innovation wave to the back of the box, then off the box entirely. Underneath that hesitation was a deeper blind spot. RCA still thought in terms of controlling airwaves and screens, not in terms of giving viewers control over time and choice. Its story is one of a company that had mastered scarcity and synchronization, suddenly facing abundance and freedom. The living room was no longer a captive audience. It was becoming a self-programming node. And once that grip on time started to loosen, other hands moved in. Cable, satellite, pay-per-view, and finally the internet would each grab a piece of what RCA thought it owned forever. The pattern that doomed it was already visible in that spinning cassette. It's an example of what happens when a company protects yesterday's choke points while tomorrow's are quietly being built somewhere else. And RCA was about to learn that lesson again on a much bigger stage. If RCA's mistake was defending the wrong gate, Polaroid's mistake was believing the gate itself could never be moved. There was a time when instant photography was magic, and Polaroid owned the spell. By the early 1970s, its cameras sat on millions of coffee tables. Its film packs were a quiet tax on every birthday, wedding, and family vacation. Then the giant woke up. Kodak, the monarch of traditional film, decided it wanted that magic too. Not only did Kodak dominate the yellow film boxes in every supermarket, it controlled chemistry, distribution, and an empire of labs and processing plants. When it stepped into instant photography in 1976 with its own cameras and film, it wasn't a small competitor. It was a tidal wave aimed straight at Polaroid's heart. Polaroid's leaders read that move as an existential insult. They had spent decades building a fortress of patents around instant imaging, hundreds of tightly written claims on everything from the chemistry in the film pods to the rollers inside the camera. So instead of treating Kodak's entrance as a warning to reinvent, they treated it as a declaration of war. Lawsuits were filed. Engineers who might have been exploring digital sensors or electronic displays were instead preparing diagrams for court. For more than a decade, the company poured money, time, and attention into the legal battle. This wasn't a side project. It became a parallel life for Polaroid. Executives sat in conference rooms with lawyers, not designers. The brightest minds in instant photography combed through old lab notebooks, not new horizons. It's an example of what happens when a company starts to believe that defending yesterday's brilliance is safer than risking tomorrow's. In 1991, the verdict finally arrived. Polaroid won. A federal court ruled that Kodak had infringed its patents and ordered nearly $1 billion in damages. For a company of Polaroid's size, it was a staggering victory, a pile of money that seemed to prove the strategy right. The message inside the building was clear. The patents worked, the model worked, the empire was still protected by law. But outside the courthouse, the world had moved. Camcorders were creeping into living rooms. Early digital cameras were appearing in labs and on trade show floors. Consumers were getting used to screens, to video, to images that lived in electronics instead of on paper. The same decade Polaroid spent dissecting Kodak's chemistry, Sony and Canon spent building the future. Here's the moral tension. The lawsuit was righteous in a narrow sense. Kodak had copied what Polaroid invented. Yet the victory was, at times, inspiring and at times chilling. It reassured everyone that legal fortresses and intellectual property could keep change at bay, just as the foundations of film-based photography were beginning to crack. So a haunting question hangs over that billion-dollar check. What if those 10 years of focus, that army of lawyers and engineers, had been aimed not at Kodak, but at Polaroid's own addiction to film? Because another company was about to answer that question, on an even bigger screen. Because another company was about to answer that question, on an even bigger screen. Let me take you back to 1986. Headlines called it a marriage of giants. General Electric, the button-down industrial legend, buying RCA, the company that had wired America for sound and vision. Not only did this look like two empires joining forces, it sounded like the safest bet in corporate life. More scale, more money, more power. But behind the press conferences, there was a quieter calculation. GE did not lie awake dreaming about VCRs and stereo systems. GE wanted NBC, the network, the airwaves, the advertising river that flowed through American living rooms. RCA's radios, televisions, and research labs were the price of admission to that one asset. There was a time when the RCA logo on a TV set meant the future was literally parked in your living room. This was the company that had helped invent color television, that had founded NBC back in 1926, that had turned broadcast into a national habit. Its story is one of laboratories and long bets, of engineers who could spend years chasing a better tube or a cleaner signal. Then the deal closed and the tone changed overnight. GE moved through RCA like an auditor with a stopwatch, counting minutes, counting dollars, counting anything that did not immediately serve quarterly earnings. Consumer electronics plants were sold off, often to foreign manufacturers eager to buy a famous name without the payroll. Research centers that once explored wild ideas in video, sound, and satellites suddenly found their budgets frozen, their projects rationalized, their people offered early retirement. Inside the buildings, the culture clash was almost physical. RCA's world had been sprawling and at times gloriously inefficient. Engineers arguing over waveforms, chemists tinkering with phosphors, managers tolerating dead ends because that was the price of the one breakthrough that might change the market. GE brought something very different: Six Sigma charts, return on equity targets, a ruthless insistence that every division justify its existence in hard numbers or be broken up and sold. On paper, the strategy worked. GE's shareholders enjoyed the ride. NBC became the glittering jewel. Yet something less visible was being stripped away. Those television factories in Indiana and Tennessee, those antenna and semiconductor lines, those research groups that had once made RCA a synonym for engineering wealth. Piece by piece, the hardware empire was hollowed out while the crown asset, NBC, shone brighter than ever. And the name? The famous 3 letters survived, but as a logo rented out for mid-range and low-end electronics, stamped on products designed and built by companies that had never set foot in an RCA lab. It's an example of what happens when a brand outlives the institution that gave it a soul. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the dismantling of RCA looked like textbook financial discipline. Yet while one giant was selling its past to own the airwaves, another still believed its patents and prestige could hold back the tide. As RCA's life was being chopped into marketable parts, Polaroid was doubling down on film, just as the digital wave finally crested. There was a time when the sound of a Polaroid ejecting from a camera was as common as a phone buzzing today. A mechanical whir, a slap of white-framed paper, and then everyone leaning in, watching the image bloom out of nothing like a magic trick you could hold in your hand. Let me take you back to the 1970s. Suburban living rooms, avocado green kitchens, shag carpet, wood paneling. At birthday parties, the person holding the Polaroid wasn't just taking pictures, they were holding power. Vacations to Disney, first days of school, weddings, barbecues, the new car in the driveway, even the private moments that never went anywhere near a photo lab. The camera came out, the flash popped, and a tiny square of someone's life slid into existence in seconds. You didn't just own a camera, you owned the moment. Polaroid sat at the center of that ritual, and in 1972, it doubled down on the fantasy. The SX70 arrived like an artifact from the future, a sleek leather-wrapped machine that folded flat, snapped open with a satisfying click, and spat out color photos without peel-apart chemicals or messy tabs. Not only was it a technological leap, it was a design object, something you could casually place on a coffee table like a sculpture. Ansel Adams, who could have dismissed it as a toy, called it a photographer's dream. That endorsement didn't just sell cameras. It crowned Polaroid as the empire of instant photography, ruling over both art and family snapshots. Behind that elegance was a roaring industrial engine. By the late 1970s, more than 2/3 of Polaroid's revenue came from instant film. Cameras were the razor, film was the blade, and the blades never stopped moving. Factories ran around the clock, churning out cartridges by the millions, chemicals carefully layered so that an image could develop in daylight. Every click of a shutter meant more money, more growth, more proof that the company had solved consumer photography for good. Inside headquarters, the mood reflected that success. There was genuine idealism, a belief that science and creativity could improve everyday life, that giving a family instant control over their images was almost a public service. But woven through that mission was a quiet, confident arrogance. Executives talked patents, chemistry, precision engineering. Rivals were dismissed as latecomers playing catch-up. Film was not just a product, it was the air the company breathed. And that dependence was the problem. The higher film sales climbed, the harder it became for anyone to imagine a future where the right strategic move would be to drive those sales to zero on purpose. Proposing a camera that didn't need film wasn't just radical, it sounded disloyal. It threatened bonuses, factories, identities, an entire way of life. It's an example of what happens when a business model becomes a belief system. Out in the wider world, pixels were getting cheaper, sensors were getting smaller, and competitors were quietly asking a question Polaroid could barely say out loud. What happens when the picture no longer needs the print at all? Out in that wider world, while Polaroid argued about prints, another giant was quietly doing the opposite. It was wiring itself into every signal that entered the home. There was a time when if you turned on a television, twisted a radio dial, or dropped a record on the turntable, you were stepping into one company's empire, whether you knew it or not. That company was RCA. By the 1950s and 1960s, RCA did not just make televisions, it defined what a television was allowed to be. The logo sat on the front of the set in the living room, but its power ran much deeper. It manufactured TVs and radios by the millions, owned the NBC television and radio networks that filled those screens with life, and controlled key patents that every rival manufacturer had to license. Selling a competing TV meant quietly sending money back to the very company you were trying to beat. That is what vertical power looks like when it is finished. Let me take you back to the dawn of color. Early color television was a battlefield of incompatible systems, flickering hues, and massive engineering egos. RCA poured money into research labs, armies of engineers, and test broadcasts, then poured more into Washington, lobbying regulators to make its color system the national standard. When the NTSC color standard was finally adopted, it locked in decades of licensing fees and influence. Every color broadcast, every color set, carried a faint echo of that decision. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling, a triumph of engineering and a reminder of who got paid every time America tuned in. But RCA did not stop at the screen and the signal. It reached into the soundtrack of daily life. Through RCA records, the same 3 letters appeared on vinyl sleeves stacked next to the hi-fi, on cassette tapes rattling around in teenagers' bedrooms, on crooners, rock bands, and country stars. His master's voice dog listened faithfully as families ate dinner with NBC News in the background and RCA records spinning after dessert. Hardware, broadcast, and music all loop back to the same balance sheet. For a mid-century American family, this created an aura of inevitability. You bought a TV, you bought RCA. You turned it on, you watched NBC or listened to an RCA licensed signal. You wanted music, you went to a store and flipped through row after row of RCA Records artists. His story is one of total immersion, brand as furniture, as soundtrack, as invisible toll booth on the culture. Yet even as the glow looked permanent, hairline cracks were forming. Cheaper sets from Japan and Europe began nibbling at the low end. Regulators started to ask whether one empire controlled too much of the airwaves, and cable, satellites, and videotape whispered that the age of 3 big networks could not last forever. RCA still owned the tower, the camera, and the song, but what happens when the audience starts looking for a different stage altogether? There was a time when inside Polaroid's walls, one name carried the same weight RCA once had over the airwaves: Edwin Land. Not only the founder, but the scientist, the artist, the philosopher, CEO, whose presence could silence a room of PhDs and MBAs in a single step. Let me take you back to those corridors in the 1960s and 70s. Portraits of Land on the walls, his speeches passed around like sacred texts. Young engineers repeating his lines about seeing what others could not. To work at Polaroid, then, was to join a mission, not just a company. Land walked the factories at night, held marathon brainstorming sessions, and expected everyone to blend chemistry, optics, and design into something humane. His story is one of a man who believed technology should feel like magic in your hands, not machinery in a lab. Because of that belief, the labs were lavish by industrial standards. Experimental cameras everywhere, custom lenses, early CCD sensors quietly being tested, while the public still thought film was the future. Land poured money into education programs, art collaborations, even letting photographers like Ansel Adams roam the halls and critique prototypes. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling. Inspiring in its faith in human creativity, chilling in how firmly Land believed that instant film had already fulfilled the company's core mission. Instant photography to him was the humane interface. The camera, the print, the family gathered around as the image appeared. Why chase cold pixels when warm paper already transformed life? That conviction seeped into the culture. Even as some researchers started building crude digital imagers, the dominant story said, the empire has already been built. The rest is refinement. Inside the research labs, a different energy simmered. Young engineers saw CCDs getting cheaper, memory improving, computers shrinking. They sketched digital Polaroids on whiteboards, cameras that could show images instantly without a cartridge, without chemical packs, without the razor and blade dependence on film that generated so much money. Across the parking lot, the business units were staring at quarterly charts, tracking film volume by the millions of packs, calculating how any drop would hit bonuses and debt covenants. Because the film margins were so rich and the forecasts so fragile, executives started to say the quiet part out loud. A truly good digital camera from Polaroid would be premature. It would confuse the market. It might destroy the film business before there's a replacement profit engine. That is cannibalization fear in its purest form, defending today's cash cow with tomorrow's opportunity tied to the stake. And here is the uncomfortable question that still hangs over every boardroom clinging to its legacy. Is it really innovation if the only ideas that get greenlit are the ones that leave the current empire untouched? Or is it an example of what happens when a culture worships a past breakthrough so intensely that it slowly, politely refuses to build the next one? Because while Polaroid was busy defending its past miracle, something eerily similar was happening on the other side of the living room. There was a time when RCA did not just make TVs, it owned the air those TVs breathed. It held patents, ran factories, and controlled NBC, one of the big three networks that dictated what an entire nation watched every night at 8 p.m. Then, quietly at first, the coaxial cables started crawling into American homes. Let me take you back to the 1970s and early 1980s, when cable TV was still a curiosity in many cities. Instead of three big networks and a fuzzy local station, cable promised dozens, then hundreds of channels. Sports all day, movies uncut, niche channels for kids, music, news, even weather. It was a different kind of power, not one signal blasting out to everyone, but a pipeline that could slice the audience into 1,000 profitable fragments. Inside RCA, the engineers could see it. They ran models that showed what would happen if viewers no longer depended on a handful of broadcast towers, if NBC's share dropped, if advertisers followed the audience into cable's maze of channels, if the over-the-air patents that had once printed money for the company suddenly mattered a lot less than who owned the wire and the box on top of the TV. Those internal presentations were not vague warnings about the future. They were spreadsheets showing NBC's dominance eroding, charts where cable subscriptions climbed while broadcast ratings bled out, and memos arguing that the real choke point was about to move from the tower to the set-top box. Whoever owned that box and the software inside it could quietly tax every viewing decision in the home. But RCA's leadership had lived their professional life inside broadcast supremacy. To them, cable looked like a side dish, not the main course. Something that would complement NBC, extend its reach, maybe carry reruns and second-tier content. The empire was the over-the-air signal. Everything else was an accessory. So budget stayed focused on transmitters, on traditional programming, on defending patents that were losing leverage with every new cable subscriber. Here is the pattern break. While competitors were racing to build out cable infrastructure, laying lines, cutting carriage deals, and experimenting with pay channels, RCA underinvested. It dabbled in cable, touched set-top box technology, but never treated it as the new throne in the living room. No aggressive push to own the hardware standard, no ruthless bid to lock in software or billing, no attempt to make RCA the unavoidable gatekeeper of this new flow of money and attention. And yet, that box on the TV was exactly where a new empire could have been built. By the time leadership realized cable was not just another distribution method, but a shift in who held power over the viewer, it was already too late. A different breed of competitor was circling, leaner, more global, far less sentimental about the glory days of broadcast. As RCA argued over towers and channels, these new players were preparing to attack the last thing RCA still thought it owned: its hardware place in the home, and finally to eat it alive. As RCA argued over towers and channels, something quieter was happening on the living room shelf. The logo on the front of the TV stayed the same for a while, but the name on the VCR, the stereo, the camcorder began to change. There was a time when that red RCA script meant American engineering. Suddenly, it was sitting next to sleek black rectangles that said Sony, Panasonic, JVC. Let me take you back to the late 1960s and 70s. Japanese electronics firms arrived with a very different religion: quality, miniaturization, and relentless iteration. Sony bragged not about patriotic heritage, but about how small its Trinitron sets were, how sharp the picture looked, how quiet the mechanism sounded when a tape loaded. Panasonic and JVC chased the same vision, shaving weight off cassette decks, shrinking radios to pocket size, turning televisions from bulky furniture into precision machines. They moved fast. New VCR models every year, new tape formulations, new remotes, new on-screen menus. They undercut RCA on price, yet somehow still made the devices feel more advanced. A Sony Walkman did not just play music, it whispered that the future was portable. A JVC VCR did not just record a show, it quietly introduced the idea that the viewer, not the broadcaster, controlled time. RCA, once the empire builder of broadcasting, found itself reacting to features that were being defined in Tokyo boardrooms, not in New Jersey labs. Because these companies obsessed over reliability, the effect in the home was subtle but devastating. The Japanese sets turned on every time, the tracking held, the color stayed stable. RCA's offerings, increasingly assembled under license or squeezed by cost controls, felt a little more fragile, a little more dated each year. Parents might still trust the old American name, but their kids. They wanted the thing that looked like it belonged on the starship, not in Grandma's den. That was the real shift in power. Younger buyers started to associate cutting-edge tech, the glamorous life they saw in music videos and sci-fi films, with Japanese brands. RCA began to feel like a story from another era, a brand that lived in black and white memories even as the world went full color. It's an example of what happens when a company confuses having a legacy with having a future. RCA's response revealed just how tired the machine had become. Instead of pouring money into breakthrough hardware, it leaned harder on its patent portfolio, its licensing deals, its past achievements in color TV and broadcasting. The company collected royalty checks while rivals collected data from real customers, refining products, learning what people would actually pay for. His story is one of power slowly draining away without a single dramatic explosion, just a steady erosion every holiday season as more Japanese boxes appeared under American Christmas trees. By the time General Electric carved RCA apart for its media assets, the hardware battlefield was already lost. The logo that once stood for the future of the living room was quietly disappearing from the front of new screens. And while RCA was being pushed out of the home by a Japanese wave of televisions and VCRs, another front was opening. Polaroid, still confident in its instant film wealth, was about to meet its own foreign challengers. Companies that saw digital imaging not as a threat to the old business, but as the birth of an entirely new one. There was a time when a Polaroid print felt like a tiny miracle, a sheet of paper that could pull an image out of chemical fog in under a minute. But while families were still shaking those square frames in living rooms, far away in labs another kind of image was being born, one that didn't need paper at all. Let me take you back to the early 1980s. The first digital sensors were crude, grainy grids of light-sensitive pixels. Cameras using them were absurdly expensive, low resolution, and awkward. Early Sony Mavicas, Kodak prototypes, strange boxy devices from Japanese labs that saved electronic photographs onto floppy disks. To most of the world, they looked like toys, novelties for engineers and journalists, not a threat to a glamorous instant film empire. On paper, the numbers looked reassuring for Polaroid. A digital camera that cost thousands of dollars and produced images barely good enough for a newspaper versus a $30 plastic camera that gave you rich color prints you could pin to the fridge. But the danger wasn't in the first shot. It was in the second and the 100th and the 1000th. Every Polaroid moment carried a quiet meter running in the background. Each click burned a physical sheet of film, chemicals, packaging, manufacturing overhead, all rolled into a few dollars per pack. That was the business model. Sell the camera cheap, make the real money on the film. Digital flipped that logic. Once a consumer bought a digital camera, the marginal cost of the next photo was effectively zero. One more shot was just a few extra electrons on a memory card. This didn't just nibble at Polaroid's profits. It attacked the core of what made the company powerful. Instant photography had always sold itself as freedom. Shoot when you want, see it right away. But when screens and memory cards entered the story, that freedom suddenly had a new definition. Instant no longer meant wait 60 seconds while chemicals develop. Instant meant see it the millisecond after you press the shutter, delete it if you hate it, take 10 more for free. The magic of watching an image fade in on paper began to look slow. The thick white borders began to look wasteful. The finite pack of 10 shots in your pocket began to feel like a limitation, not a luxury. It's an example of what happens when a company's proudest invention is quietly redefined as a constraint. Meanwhile, in Japan, rivals treated those ugly early sensors as the future. Companies like Canon, Nikon, Sony, and Fuji poured engineers and money into CCDs and then CMOS chips, into sharper lenses, better storage, brighter LCDs. They assumed that resolution would climb, prices would fall, and one day a digital camera would be good enough for every family vacation, every birthday, every casual snapshot that used to belong to Polaroid by default. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the race was ruthless. Each new generation of digital camera crept closer to film quality, while the cost per photo raced toward zero. Polaroid watched, experimented at the edges, but stayed structurally tied to film because that was where the wealth came from. 2/3 of its revenue depended on people buying those packs over and over. So here's the moral tension. Could Polaroid have led the digital revolution, even if it meant deliberately destroying its own film profits? Or was the company so addicted to that chemical cash flow that it could never fully back a technology that made every additional picture free? In the next chapter, that addiction is going to meet reality, as the numbers on Polaroid's balance sheet finally collide with the pixels on everyone else's screens. So Polaroid had a choice: kill the film cash cow or let someone else kill it. On paper, the answer seems obvious. In real life, what happened next looked less like a bold pivot and more like a nervous compromise dressed up as innovation. Let me take you back to the mid-1990s. There was a time when a digital camera still felt exotic, when memory cards were tiny in capacity but huge in price, and when Polaroid finally showed up to the party. The company rolled out digital models with its famous rainbow logo on the front, but inside, many were rebadged designs from anonymous manufacturers built to be cheap, not legendary. Gone were the sculpted bodies, the clever folding mechanisms, the sense that this object had been obsessed over. These were rectangles with buttons. On launch posters and in catalogs, the contrast was almost painful. The glorious SX70 and its descendants still got the glamour shots, the lifestyle scenes, the promise of instant, tangible magic. The The digital cameras, they were tucked into the margins like accessories, mentioned alongside carrying cases and extra batteries, sold in blister packs at warehouse clubs. Not the core of a future empire, just another gadget on the shelf. Inside the company, that positioning wasn't an accident. The digital division lived on tight rations. Small teams were told to move fast, prove profitability immediately, and above all, not threaten the film business that still brought in most of the money. Pricing meetings became a kind of ritual contradiction. Make it attractive, but not too attractive. Good enough to sell, but never so good that a loyal customer would stop buying packs of film every weekend. It's an example of what happens when a company tries to protect yesterday's wealth while pretending to chase tomorrow's. The result was a strange double life. On one side of the hallway, executives still talked about chemistry, silver halides, and the romance of paper prints. On the other, underfunded engineers tried to squeeze a little more resolution out of bargain sensors, knowing their work could never be allowed to undercut the real profit engine. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the story of those teams is one of talent trapped inside a defensive strategy. Consumers felt that tension, even if they couldn't articulate it. Here was a brand that had once redefined what a family memory looked like, now selling digital cameras with no clear reason to exist. They weren't the best, or the cheapest, or the most powerful. They were just there. In a crowded aisle next to Canon, Sony, and Nikon, the Polaroid name no longer meant automatic trust. It meant a faint, nostalgic question. Didn't they make those old instant cameras? Then came the pattern break no one in those pricing meetings had truly planned for. While Polaroid hesitated over how fast to leave film, another shift was already underway. Modems were screeching to life, browsers were spreading, and tiny screens in early mobile phones were quietly learning how to see. The next battle wouldn't be over which camera you bought, but over whether a camera was a separate object at all. And in that world, the danger for Polaroid wasn't just weak digital products. It was something far more brutal, the possibility that taking a picture would stop being a hardware decision and become a software habit. So while Polaroid was staring down a future where the camera might dissolve into an app, another giant from the living room had already been quietly dismantled. There was a time when the letters RCA on a TV didn't just mean brand. They meant you were plugged into the very empire that built broadcasting itself. Let me take you back to the mid-1980s. RCA owned NBC, held key television patents, and sold the sets that sat in front of millions of families every night. It was hardware, networks, standards, and culture fused into one machine. Then General Electric walked in with a checkbook. GE didn't want the whole life of RCA. It wanted the crown jewel, NBC. So it bought the company, carved away the parts it liked, and within a few years, the once mighty consumer electronics division was sold off, broken into pieces and scattered. What remained on store shelves still said RCA. But behind the logo, the world had changed. Instead of armies of in-house engineers in New Jersey labs defining color standards and tuner designs, the RCA TV in the aisle might be designed by an ODM in Asia, manufactured in a plant that had never seen an RCA badge, and simply licensed the name for a fee. The company that had once dictated how the signal should look was now renting out its initials to whoever could move boxes at a profit. Over time, the meaning eroded. Because of that relentless licensing, RCA appeared on everything and commanded respect on almost nothing. Tube sets, then cheap stereos, then DVD players, clock radios, off-brand feeling flat screens, all wearing the same red logo. The engineering culture that once pushed color television, broadcast antennas, and satellite systems had no real say over these devices. It was an example of what happens when a technology powerhouse trades patents and labs for contracts and style guides. Walk through a big box store in the 2000s, and the contrast was almost comic. The same logo that once stood for cutting-edge power in the age of black and white to color now sat on bargain bin DVD players stacked under house brands. Next to Samsung and Sony's gleaming displays, an RCA set looked like a memory that had been put on clearance. Dry irony in plastic form. Psychologically, it landed in two very different ways. Older viewers felt a twinge of nostalgia, a flashback to the family console TV, the rabbit ears, the night the moon landing flickered through an RCA tube. Younger buyers barely recognized the name at all, or if they did, they didn't associate it with wealth, innovation, or any special quality. Just another cheap option, another logo in a crowded aisle. RCA didn't technically die, it hollowed out. The body kept walking through licensing deals while the original mind was long gone. Polaroid, on the other hand, was about to face something harsher than a slow fading of meaning. Outright, public, humiliating bankruptcy. Polaroid didn't just fade from the shelf, it walked into a courtroom as a conquering hero and walked out of a bankruptcy court as a cautionary tale. Not only had it beaten Kodak for billions over instant film, it was still a household name, still a symbol of fun, memory, and a little bit of magic. But there was a time when that magic hit an ugly spreadsheet. By the late 1990s, film sales had stopped climbing and then quietly began to fall. The empire Edwin Land built depended on those little packs of chemistry. More than 2/3 of revenue still came from instant film. Meanwhile, digital cameras were getting cheaper, sharper, and everywhere. Polaroid was carrying huge legacy costs. Factories, chemical plants, paper suppliers, pension promises, all designed for a world where every memory passed through a pot of dye. Management saw the storm, but treated it like bad weather, not a new climate. Instead of tearing the company down to rebuild it as a digital-first business, they tried to squeeze more money out of the old machine. Prices on film went up, costs were slashed, plants were consolidated. The brand was licensed onto sunglasses, scanners, even televisions, as if the logo alone could pay the bills. It's an example of what happens when a company defends its past margins harder than it pursues its future relevance. On paper, there were digital projects. Polaroid sold digital cameras, little photo printers, even hybrid systems that spit out small instant stickers. Yet the real money, the real power inside the company, still lived in film. Executives were judged on quarterly numbers, not on whether the next generation would ever love a Polaroid sensor the way their parents loved a Polaroid print. His story is one of how a culture built on chemistry struggled to fall in love with code. As film volume slipped, the math turned ruthless. Less film sold meant factories ran below capacity, which drove unit costs up, which pushed leadership to raise prices again, which pushed more consumers to digital. Debt that once seemed manageable became a weight. Polaroid borrowed to fund restructurings, to cover dividends, to try one more marketing push. Targets were missed, forecasts revised, then missed again. Creditors grew nervous, ratings fell. The company that had once printed wealth from silver halides was now struggling to pay interest in cash. In October 2001, just a decade after humiliating Kodak in court, Polaroid filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The timing was brutal. While the world was uploading its first grainy party photos and vacation shots, the inventor of the instant photograph was telling a judge it could not pay its creditors. There was a time when pressing that big white shutter button was the fastest way to see a moment. Now, the fastest way was a pixelated LCD, and Polaroid didn't own that future. Symbolically, it was devastating. A company that had taught families to expect immediacy in their memories was dying precisely because everyone still wanted instant, just without paper, chemicals, or waiting. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the rise and fall showed how quickly dominance can turn into fragility. Yet even as the factories went dark and employees lost their jobs, something refused to die. The name Polaroid still meant something on a box. The logo still triggered a feeling, and what happened to that name next would reveal an uncomfortable truth about how modern capitalism treats its fallen icons. Because in the years after bankruptcy, the brand would live on, even as the original company did not, and the way it came back says more about nostalgia, money, and borrowed glory than about film or cameras at all. There was a time when Polaroid meant one thing, a camera that whirred, spat out a square, and made a living room feel like a studio. After bankruptcy, that meaning was put on the auction block. The name, the rainbow logo, the patents, the chemical formulas, even the archives of decades of experiments were broken into pieces and sold to whoever could write a check. The empire Edwin Land built as an integrated machine, labs, factories, film coating lines, camera design teams, was dismantled. In its place came holding companies, private equity funds, and licensing firms whose business was not making film, but renting out memories. Because Polaroid still had power. The word alone could pull an entire family back to birthdays on shag carpet and washed out flashes in the basement. So a new wave began. Suddenly, Polaroid reappeared on shelves, but now it was stamped on digital point-and-shoots designed in one office, manufactured in another country, and pushed into big-box stores by third-party distributors. There were Polaroid-branded inkjet printers, Bluetooth speakers, cheap tablets, even sunglasses. Many had no real connection to the old technology. They were generic electronics wearing a vintage costume, trading on the retro charm of that familiar logo. Then something stranger happened. As the mass market brand drifted, a niche revival rose from the ashes. Let me take you back to the late 2000s when a group of former employees and enthusiasts took over part of the last Polaroid factory in the Netherlands. They called it, with dark humor, the Impossible Project. They tried to resurrect instant film without the original chemicals, suppliers, or Land's research army. The results were temperamental, expensive, unpredictable, and artists and hipsters loved them. Because now the flaws were the feature. Light leaks, color shifts, uneven development turned into an aesthetic. New Polaroid-style cameras, limited runs of film, gallery shows, wedding photographers charging premium prices for what grandparents once did for free in the kitchen. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling, a dead technology reborn as a luxury experience. But underneath that romance was a disconnect. The Polaroid name still evoked warmth, creativity, the idea that technology could collapse distance between people. Yet the original institution that made that feeling possible, the obsessive labs, the vertically integrated film business, the long-time horizons, was gone. What remained was a logo that could be pasted onto almost anything with a lens or a battery. Here's the pattern interrupt. When a brand outlives the company that built it, what exactly are we buying? The product, or just the story? It's an example of what happens when nostalgia becomes a business model, when wealth is wrung from a memory long after the innovators have left the building. And Polaroid would not be the only ghost wandering through modern living rooms. There was a time when RCA didn't just sell televisions, it owned the very idea of television. Patents on scanning, on color, on transmission, layered one on top of another, until every signal that crossed the air felt like a toll road feeding the same empire. Let me take you back to the 1920s and 30s. RCA stitched together radio patents from General Electric, Westinghouse, AT&T. then wrapped them in a legal shell that made broadcasting a privilege, not a right. Later, when television arrived, the pattern intensified. Color standards, receiver designs, tuner circuits, even the shape of the plug on the back of the set. Behind each one stood an RCA lawyer, ready to license, ready to sue, ready to make money whether a family bought an RCA set or a rival brand. Because of this, a dangerous belief took root inside the company. Product teams mattered, engineers mattered, but the real power seemed to live in the patent department and the Washington office. Executives learned that dominance came from controlling standards, from influencing regulators, from turning the Federal Communications Commission into an unofficial referee for their business model. Innovation became something to protect with paperwork, not something to constantly reinvent in the living room. It's an example of what happens when legal success starts to feel like technological success. RCA grew accustomed to winning in conference rooms instead of showrooms, to extracting royalties from competitors' breakthroughs instead of feeling threatened by them. So when new formats appeared, VCRs from Japan, cable channels that bypassed broadcast towers, later home video game consoles and camcorders, the reflex was to negotiate, to tax, to lobby, not to rip up the roadmap and start over. Polaroid fell into the same trance. His story is one of beautiful cameras and ruthless court filings. When Kodak barged into instant photography in the 1970s, Polaroid responded with a legal war that dragged on for more than a decade. The company won billions in damages. On paper, it was a triumph. In life, it was a distraction. While executives celebrated in court, digital sensors were getting cheaper, memory cards smaller, and entire generations learned to see photography as pixels, not chemicals. Both companies trusted the law to freeze time. RCA assumed broadcast patents would soften the blow of cable and home recording. Polaroid assumed its instant film portfolio would shield it from a world where instant meant a glowing screen, not a warm print. That illusion of safety dulled urgency. RCA was slow to lead in VCRs, slow in personal computers, slow in embracing the very digital standards that would define the next century. Polaroid, meanwhile, treated digital as a side project while defending film margins that looked impressive right up until they collapsed. So here's the uncomfortable question. When Apple amasses chip and interface patents, when Qualcomm lives on licensing, when streaming giants negotiate exclusive rights and geo-blocked catalogs, are they building resilience or just another legal moat around a business model already shifting under their feet? The law can delay change. It has never on its own stopped it. In the next chapter, that slow realization finally reaches the boardroom, and the unraveling begins. That unraveling didn't start with a dramatic crash. It began in conference rooms with slide decks and smiling executives pointing at charts that all seemed to go up and to the right. There was a time when those charts were treated like holy scripture, proof that the empire was healthy, even as the ground quietly shifted under every living room they served. Let me take you back to a Polaroid board meeting in the late 1980s. On the wall, film volumes, profit per pack, camera install base. Instant film still made up the majority of revenue. Margins were fat, and every marketing push produced a neat little bump in unit sales. The message was simple. Families still loved the magic of watching a picture appear in their hands. The money was still flowing. The story, on paper, looked safe. But those numbers were rearview mirrors. They measured what consumers had already done, not what they were about to do. Early digital cameras were clunky, expensive, and easy to dismiss, so their tiny sales barely registered. Yet in college labs, in engineering departments, in the hands of early adopters, a different habit was forming. Take as many photos as you want. Delete the bad ones. Share them without ever touching film. None of that showed up on Polaroid's main dashboards. RCA lived inside a similar illusion. Executives tracked television's set market share, licensing revenue from core TV patents, and quarterly profits from selling hardware to a world that still gathered around a single glowing screen. Cable subscriptions were climbing, VCRs were creeping into cabinets, viewing habits were fragmenting, but RCA's reports focused on how many TVs it shipped, not how audiences were slipping away into 100 channels and eventually 1,000 screens. Whenever a disruptive threat appeared, the metrics could be summoned as a defense. Digital imaging, instant film sales just jumped after the latest ad campaign. Cable and VCRs, TV licensing income was still strong. NBC ratings anchors still looked untouchable. It's an example of what happens when positive short-term numbers become an argument against long-term reality. The better the quarter, the easier it was to say the danger was exaggerated. In modern language, they were worshipping lagging indicators. Film volume, TV unit share, quarterly profit, all excellent at describing yesterday, almost useless at predicting tomorrow. Leading indicators, the number of photos stored digitally, hours spent on cable instead of broadcast, time families spent with camcorders instead of instant prints, were treated as curiosities, not alarms. His story is one of ruthless efficiency. Theirs is one of ruthless denial. Both are, at times, inspiring and at times chilling, because they show how power can blind as easily as it can build. So here's the uncomfortable question. Inside today's tech giants, which dashboards are lighting up green while the future quietly walks out the side door? As streaming minutes, daily active users, and ad impressions are celebrated, what slow motion collapse is already underway that their favorite charts will only reveal when it's finally too late. When the dashboards are lying, the next warning doesn't come from a spreadsheet. It walks out the door carrying a cardboard box and 20 years of hard-won knowledge. There was a time when Polaroid and RCA buildings emptied that way, one badge swipe at a time, as the future quietly left to work somewhere that would actually build it. Inside Polaroid's labs in the late 1970s, young engineers were already playing with charge-coupled devices and crude digital sensors. They could see that silver halide chemistry, no matter how beloved, was living on borrowed time. Yet every bold prototype ran into the same wall. This threatens the film business. The message from above was clear. Protect the instant film empire. Protect the margins. Protect the quarterly money. Protect, don't reinvent. One imaging engineer later described pitching a low-resolution digital camera that could connect to a computer. Management smiled, asked where to put the film pack, and ended the meeting. A few years later, he left, joined a semiconductor firm in California, and helped design sensors for early digital point-and-shoots. The device his old bosses had laughed at became an entire industry. That is how a company that literally invented the selfie watched strangers monetize its own idea. RCA had its own quiet exodus. His story is one of power, then paralysis. In the 1960s, the company poured money into color TVs, satellites, and even mainframes. But by the late 1970s, a thick layer of bureaucracy had settled over everything. Engineers who wanted to explore microprocessors or interactive cable services found themselves stuck in meetings about protecting tube factories and defending old TV standards. Because of that defensive mindset, the most ambitious people stopped fighting and started updating their resumes. One mid-level manager from RCA's broadcast division left after a proposal for a cable-only experimental channel died in committee. Too weird, too niche. not our business. He joined a scrappy media startup that believed the opposite. That startup grew into a cable network era that would finally make niche the new normal, while RCA, the company that had once owned NBC and the airwaves themselves, became a footnote in someone else's programming guide. Here is the vicious cycle. As the most frustrated innovators walk away, the people who remain are, by definition, the ones most comfortable with how things are. The culture tilts a little more conservative, a little more risk-averse, a little more in love with its own past success. Ambitious projects look even stranger to that audience, so fewer are greenlit, more builders leave, and the spiral tightens. Now contrast that with the places they landed. Let me take you back to those early digital imaging startups and new media outfits. Cramped offices, cheap coffee, no legacy to defend. Former Polaroid chemists suddenly free to say, what if there is no film at all? Ex-RCA engineers finally allowed to stream video over primitive networks, without being told it would cannibalize broadcast. The same people, the same brains, just moved from a museum to a construction site. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it's an example of what happens when a company tells its best people, in 100 subtle ways, that the real future is unwelcome. The moment the most capable builders conclude they have to leave to build what's next, the company has already made its choice. It has chosen the past, and once that choice is made, the only real question left is how long the present can pretend otherwise. Once that choice is made, the present can pretend for a while. But the consumer never pretends. The consumer moves on. There was a time when that movement was painfully slow, when the entire rhythm of family life bent around scarcity. Let me take you back to a living room in 1975. The TV is a heavy RCA console, tuned to one of 3 major networks. If a show airs at 8, the family is on the couch at 8 or they miss it. No rewinding, no pausing, no second chances. On the coffee table, a Polaroid SX70, a pack of 10 shots that cost real money. Every click is a decision. Birthday candle or silly face? New baby or the dog? Each image feels like it carries a tiny piece of the family's wealth. In that world, scarcity is not a bug. It is the business model. RCA thrives because it owns the channels, the hardware, the patents, the schedule. Polaroid thrives because every camera sold is a promise of years of film purchases, a razor and blade empire built on 10 precious frames at a time. Their pricing, their margins, their power all assume the same thing, that attention and images will always be rationed. Then slowly at first, abundance arrives. Camcorders and VCRs let viewers tape shows and watch later. Cable explodes from 3 channels to 30, then to hundreds. Digital cameras appear with memory cards that hold not 10 pictures, but hundreds, then thousands. Finally, phones collapse camera and screen into one slab of glass, backed by cloud storage that makes the old limits feel almost comic. Because of that technological flood, the old scarcity economics begin to look ruthless in the wrong way. Paying a premium for 10 instant photos when a cheap digital camera can shoot all day? Waiting for a Thursday night lineup when DVDs, then streaming, let you watch entire seasons in a weekend? The consumer's expectations shift from make this one shot count to why should any shot count more than a fraction of a cent? Polaroid's pricing stays welded to film packs. RCA's world is still built around appointment viewing, broadcast schedules, and hardware cycles tuned to network seasons. In a universe of cheap storage and rising bandwidth, those choices feel dated, even a little insulting. The story of their decline is not only about missed technologies, it is about misreading a psychological break. Once people taste abundance, they do not go back. And that raises an uncomfortable question for the present. If scarcity-priced photos and rigid TV grids collapsed under abundance, what happens to today's subscription bundles and microtransactions when consumers grow used to even more? It's an example of what happens when a model survives longer than the patience of the audience. The next giants will not be beaten only by better technology. They will be beaten when the bill feels heavier than the freedom it buys. And then something even quieter happened than a bill getting too high. The living room stopped caring whose name was on the box. There was a time when the logo alone carried power. RCA on the console meant the empire of broadcasting had reached into your home. Polaroid on the camera meant instant wealth in memories, a little miracle that turned chemistry into family ritual. But as the 80s slipped into the 90s, televisions and cameras began to blur into one long wall of rectangles and lenses, and the question changed from who made it to what does it do and how cheap is it? That shift sounds small. It was ruthless. Let me take you back to the big box aisle, fluorescent lights, endless shelves. A teenager in a blue polo shirt reciting features from a laminated card. Shoppers weren't whispering about RCA's role in inventing color TV or Polaroid's artistic legacy. They were comparing screen sizes, remote controls, number of inputs. Did it have S-video, component, later HDMI? For cameras, it was megapixels, zoom, whether it came with a free memory card. The life of a product was reduced to ports and pixels, rebates, and weekend discounts. Because of that shift in behavior, the old premium attached to those names began to evaporate. RCA had once charged more because it was RCA. Polaroid had once sold not just a camera, but the promise that every click would work. Now, next to a cheaper house brand that looked similar, performed similarly, and came with the same 12-month warranty, that premium felt like nostalgia priced as a luxury tax. Retailers noticed, manufacturers noticed, and they acted. Big chains quietly pushed their own labels, imported boards, generic chassis, and slapped on whatever logo maximized margin that quarter. RCA and Polaroid, already weakened, were easy tiles to swap out in the mosaic. When the product is a commodity, shelf position is worth more than heritage. It's an example of what happens when a company confuses being famous with being indispensable. Because while the logo stayed trapped on plastic shells, the real power in electronics was moving elsewhere, to operating systems, to app stores, to subscription services, to clouds that remembered your photos long after any instant print had faded. Polaroid and RCA never built an ecosystem that made leaving painful. No software that held your history. No platform where friends, data, or habits accumulated into invisible gravity. Once the hardware aged, the relationship ended. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this is the moment when two giants learned that the opposite of monopoly is not always rebellion. Sometimes it is indifference. The living room simply stopped voting for them. But here is the uncomfortable question for today's giants. If hardware brands can vanish this fast, what really keeps Apple, Netflix, or Meta in your home now? And how sure are they that the hold they have over your life can't disappear just as quietly? There was a time when owning the whole machine was a dream. Not just a product, but the pipeline. From the moment a song was recorded or a photo was snapped, all the way to the glowing screen or the print in your hand. For RCA and Polaroid, that dream came true, and that is exactly what trapped them. Let me take you back to mid-century America. RCA had built a towering empire of electrons and entertainment. It owned the patents inside the TV set, the factories that made those sets, the NBC network that filled them with shows, even record labels that supplied the music. Content, distribution, hardware, all under one roof. Polaroid, in its own quieter way, did the same. A closed camera, a proprietary film, a chemical process only its labs could perfect. Every click of the shutter meant more money for the same company. It felt like unbreakable power. In the short run, it was. RCA could lean on its patents, bundle sets with its broadcasts, and dictate standards. Polaroid could sell the camera cheap and make a fortune on film, razor, and blade. But that same vertical integration hardened into armor that was too heavy to move. Any change in one layer threatened profits in another, so every bold idea triggered a civil war inside the building. When videotape, cable, and later VCRs arrived, RCA faced a brutal question. Should it back formats that let people watch recorded shows, skip live broadcasts, and spend evenings with rented movies instead of NBC? Supporting those technologies might help the hardware division, but it undercut the network's monopoly on attention. Again and again, the company hesitated, watered down, or arrived late to formats that didn't reinforce broadcast dominance. Protecting yesterday's cash flow quietly sabotaged tomorrow's. Polaroid's life followed the same pattern. At its peak, most of its wealth came from instant film. Every digital sensor, every memory card, every screen was a tiny rebellion against that chemistry. Engineers who pushed digital imaging were, in effect, asking the company to destroy its own printing press. Projects staggered forward, then lost momentum, because each pixel that didn't consume film looked like treason to the profit and loss statement. It's an example of what happens when the empire inside the org chart is more ruthless than any rival outside. Meanwhile, the disruptors stayed narrow and fast. A pure hardware maker could chase camcorders, VCRs, or flat screens without worrying about cannibalizing a network. A pure content studio could jump to cable, then streaming without defending a TV factory. With no internal factions to appease, they moved quickly, broke habits, and let the market decide which layer deserved to win. Here's the pattern interrupt. Everyone fears being too small to matter. Almost no one fears being too interconnected to move. At what point does a platform become so tightly woven that pulling any thread risks the whole tapestry? For the giants of today, that question is not theoretical, it is a countdown. There was a time when Polaroid and RCA felt as permanent as the walls of the living room, as if their logos were printed directly onto American life. Cameras on the coffee table, consoles under the TV, their names whispered in ads and jingles until they sounded less like brands and more like background radiation. But let me take you back to the quiet part of their story, the part that doesn't make the glossy ads, not the rise, the moment after. The moment when success stops feeling fragile and starts feeling like a right, that is when the danger begins. Because it's an example of what happens when a company's greatest achievement is not a product, but the belief that the world will keep revolving around that product forever. Polaroid was not led by cartoon villains, and RCA was not run by mustache-twirling saboteurs. Their leaders were talented, proud, and under enormous pressure. They had investors who demanded predictable money, factories full of workers whose families depended on the next quarter, and whole ecosystems built on film cartridges and broadcast schedules. Protecting that empire felt responsible, rational, even moral. So when digital sensors appeared, when cable and VCR started nibbling at the edges of broadcast, the choice in the boardroom was never framed as greed versus virtue. It was framed as security versus risk. Keep milking instant film or fund a technology that might destroy it. Keep defending over-the-air dominance or embrace cable that would fragment audiences and threaten ad revenue. Again and again, they chose comfort. They chose to guard what they had already built instead of cannibalizing it. Here is the moral tension. In the short term, clinging to the old model can protect thousands of jobs, keep dividends flowing, and avoid terrifying write-downs. Saying no to reinvention can feel like protecting the tribe. Yet every year that decision is repeated, the company becomes more dependent on a world that is quietly dying. The short-term mercy compounds into long-term cruelty. And the greed here was not only about money, it was about status, about control, about refusing to admit that the game had changed and that the rules they had mastered no longer applied. To step into digital or cable would have meant admitting that the empire of tubes and film was aging. It would have meant trading the comfort of being a king for the anxiety of being a beginner. So ask yourself, away from the history and the headlines, where this same pattern hides in your own life. Where are you still clinging to a familiar role, a legacy product, a business model that still pays the bills but quietly shrinks your future? Because the next chapter of this story is not about RCA or Polaroid at all. It is about the companies that rule today's living rooms and how close they already are to making the same choice. So let me take you back to a different version of this story. A timeline where the logos on those old living room machines did not vanish. They evolved. They followed you from the coffee table and the console TV straight into your phone. There was a time when Polaroid didn't just sell cameras. It sold a feeling, instant sharing, physical comments written right on the frame, a little white border that turned every moment into a tiny billboard for your life. The company owned the idea that memories should appear now, be passed around now, be judged now. In another world, that obsession with instant gratification becomes something else. Not more film, but an early online gallery, a crude social feed, a place where those same frames live on a screen instead of a shoebox. Polaroid had what every modern platform dreams of, a global brand that meant fun and authenticity, distribution into millions of homes, a loyal community of artists and teenagers already performing for the camera. It had engineers who knew how to compress, process, and render images at speed, long before upload was a household word. Turn that technical know-how toward modems instead of emulsions, and suddenly the company that invented the selfie is not filing for bankruptcy in 2001. It is quietly testing an instant wall in 1996. RCA's alternate path is even more striking. This was the empire that built broadcasting, patents, transmitters, living room sets, and through NBC, the shows themselves. It understood scheduling, audience habits, advertising money. Imagine that weight of power pointed 1 inch to the left. Instead of treating the TV as a one-way pipe, RCA could have used its network experience and content library to build primitive on-demand menus, local caching boxes, even early experiments in streaming over cable and phone lines. There were already VCRs, satellites, pay TV experiments. The ingredients were scattered across its own balance sheet. They had trust. They had reach. They had the money to absorb failure. So why did none of this happen? Inside both companies, the incentives ran the other way. Film margins, tape sales, affiliate fees, retail partners, all depended on scarcity, on appointment viewing, on making the hardware precious instead of making access cheap. Any executive who pushed for a platform that might cannibalize that cash flow was not a visionary. He was a threat. And at the top, the leadership DNA was hardware, patents, manufacturing. Not software, not the messy experimental culture of the early internet. It is an example of what happens when a company's past success quietly vetoes its future experiments, when the people who understand code and networks never make it into the room where the real decisions are made. Their story is one of mischances that now feel almost painfully obvious, which raises a darker question. If Polaroid as Instagram and RCA as Netflix were hiding in plain sight back then, what equally obvious in retrospect opportunities are today's giants refusing to see right now? There was a time when Polaroid and RCA felt as permanent as the walls of the living room. Their logos lived on coffee tables and under television screens, woven into family rituals, birthday parties, late-night shows. When a brand is present in millions of homes every day, it stops feeling like a company and starts feeling like infrastructure. And that illusion is dangerous. Executives breathed it in. Consumers did too. If every neighbor owned an RCA set and every holiday gathering ended with a Polaroid print passed around the table, then disappearance felt impossible. Market share became a substitute for foresight, and ubiquity looked like safety. Yet under that calm surface, both empires were balanced on narrow technical ledges, chemical film for one, broadcast standards for the other, each profitable, each fragile. Polaroid's life was tied to a chemistry trick. The SX70 in 1972 felt like magic, a camera that spit out memories in real time, turning moments into money with every pack of film. 2/3 of revenue came from that film, from that razor and blade model that executives adored. But when images stopped being silver crystals on paper and became numbers on a sensor, the entire foundation shook. The brand on the box still looked powerful. The physics underneath had already moved on. RCA's power came from owning the broadcast world end to end. Patents, transmitters, living room sets, and NBC pumping shows into a captive national audience. As long as the signal flowed one way, from tower to antenna, the empire looked untouchable. Yet that dominance rested on standards and regulations that assumed scarcity. A few channels, limited spectrum, one schedule for everyone. Cable, VCRs, then satellite, and finally streaming quietly rewrote those assumptions. One coaxial cable and one broadband line at a time. Network effects and brand familiarity slowed the fall. People kept buying Polaroid film long after the first clunky digital cameras appeared because the prints felt real and the process felt known. Families clung to RCA sets and broadcast habits even as cable boxes added dozens, then hundreds of channels. Familiarity buys time, it does not buy immunity. Once a clearly better alternative shows up, cheaper, more flexible, more fun, the adoption curve does not bend gently. It snaps. Look at how quickly film to digital flipped. In the late 1990s, film still dominated. By the mid-2000s, digital had crushed it, and the camera most people carried was suddenly built into a phone. Broadcast to cable, cable to streaming. Each shift looked marginal at first, then suddenly the old center was empty, leaving legacy giants scrambling to license content, sell off divisions, or quietly vanish into holding companies. Pattern interrupt. Imagine a world where the smartphone operating systems everyone uses today are remembered the way RCA's logo is now. A trivia question. Where the streaming platforms that feel like permanent utilities are just the broadcast networks of an older internet locked into monthly subscriptions, while some new paradigm makes the whole model feel slow, expensive, and strangely clumsy. It's an example of what happens when dominance is confused with durability. Apple, Netflix, Meta, Samsung, these names feel entrenched. Their apps wake people up, entertain their children, manage their money. Yet their power still rests on specific architectures, app stores, subscription bundles, attention-driven feeds. If computing shifts to something ambient and invisible, if content stops living in tiles on a screen, the next Polaroid moment may be waiting. The question is, who notices the ground moving? And who keeps admiring the view from the living room wall? There was a time when Polaroid didn't just capture memories, it defined what taking a picture at home even meant. A camera on the table, a pack of film, the quiet thrill of watching an image fade in from nothing. Today, that same emotional center of gravity sits in a different object entirely. The iPhone in a pocket, and the Photos app that quietly sorts an entire life. Let me take you back to that parallel. Polaroid owned the moment after the shutter. Apple owns everything before and after it. The lens, the sensor, the chip running computational photography, the Photos library, the iCloud backup, the shared album with family on the other side of the world. Not only is Apple the default camera for hundreds of millions of people, it is the default archive, the default frame, the default way a birthday or a child's first steps are remembered at all. That dominance feels permanent. So did Polaroids. So did RCAs. RCA once controlled the TV in the living room, the broadcast tower on the hill, and the network programming in between. Hardware, signal, content, a vertical empire that looked unbreakable. Apple's integration of hardware, software, and services echoes that same towering stack. The company designs the chips, the operating system, the camera pipeline, the cloud, the subscription services that sit on top. It is elegant, efficient, and at times inspiring, and at times chilling in how thoroughly it surrounds the user. But vertical power has a hidden cost. It can make a company ruthless toward threats outside the stack, yet strangely gentle with threats inside it. RCA clung to broadcast even as cable and VCRs crept in. Polaroid protected instant film margins while digital sensors got cheaper. For Apple, the potential blind spots are different, but rhyme. An over-reliance on iPhone money. A reluctance to let cheaper devices cannibalize premium phones. An instinct to see anything non-phone as an accessory rather than a successor. When new interfaces appear, AR glasses, lightweight head-worn displays, cameras that live on a lapel or in a room instead of in a hand, does the iPhone stay the sun or become just another planet? It's an example of what happens when a central device quietly turns into a legacy port, still profitable, still beloved, already strategically dead. To its credit, Apple has shown an unusual willingness to wound its own darlings. The iPhone erased the iPod. Apple Silicon made years of Mac designs feel instantly old. The company has, more than once, treated its past achievements as raw material for the next platform rather than a museum exhibit. The question is whether that instinct survives when the target is not a side business, but the core. When a future camera or headset or ambient system threatens the smartphone itself, does Apple pull the trigger again, or keep polishing the living room wall while the ground moves underneath? There was a time when RCA did not just make televisions, it defined what television was. It owned the patents, the cameras, the transmitters, the network, the set in your living room. In the same way, Netflix did not just join streaming, it taught the world what streaming felt like. Click a red logo, endless choice, no schedule, whole seasons dropped at once. That was not an accident, that was a template. Let me take you back to the broadcast era. If you wanted moving pictures in your home, you passed through RCA's gates. Its empire stretched from factory floor to living room sofa, from NBC's studios to the rabbit ears on top of the TV. RCA set the rules. 30-minute shows, prime time, national events that stopped family life in its tracks. Today, Netflix plays the same role for the streaming age, shaping expectations around autoplay, personalized rouse, and the quiet assumption that every screen is a portal to its library. Because Netflix moved first and moved fast, it built moats that look formidable. A massive subscriber base that pays every month, recommendation systems that decide what half the planet watches next, an ever-growing vault of original content. Yet the history of RCA shows how those same strengths can harden into constraints. When your money, power, and internal culture all orbit one delivery model, every other model feels wrong, even when it is the future. RCA optimized for scheduled broadcasts to a passive audience sitting on a couch. Netflix has optimized for on-demand, solitary binge-watching on a couch or laptop. But what happens if the next wave is not a bigger library, but a different medium entirely? Interactive narratives where the story rewrites itself in real time, AI-generated shows that customize to each viewer, decentralized platforms where creators own the pipes and the audience, or social viewing worlds where the show is just the excuse for being together, and the screen is only one element in a shared space. RCA did not lose to a better TV network. It was eroded by side technologies that changed behavior, cable that multiplied channels, VCRs that let families record and skip, game consoles that turned the television into something you controlled rather than just watched. It is an example of what happens when a company measures threats only by how much they resemble its current rivals. The danger for Netflix is not just another subscription app. It is the platform that makes the whole idea of a fixed catalog and a monthly fee feel quaint. His story is one of companies that looked permanent until suddenly they were not. Polaroid, RCA, and now Netflix stand in a single line. At times inspiring and at times chilling, their rise shows how quickly a new way of watching becomes normal, and how quickly normal can vanish. Netflix is not the final form of television. It is a chapter, and as viewers are about to see, chapters can close faster than executives ever expect. There was a time when the most social object in a room was a square of paper slowly darkening in someone's hand. Today, that role belongs to a glowing rectangle recording stories, reels, and live streams, and one company sits at the center of that lens. Meta has done to the social camera what Polaroid once did to instant film, pulled it into a single addictive system, and tried to own the moment itself. Let me take you back to those Polaroid parties for a second. The magic wasn't just the chemistry. It was the ritual. Someone clicked the shutter, the photo slid out, people crowded around, laughed, argued over who looked terrible, then pinned the image on a fridge or a dorm wall. Meta's empire of Instagram and Facebook took that same instinct and digitized it. Tap to capture, swipe to filter, tag a friend, feed the algorithm. The object changed, but the social choreography stayed eerily familiar. On Meta's platforms, the camera is no longer a neutral tool. It's a machine for identity, status, and connection. A story is proof of life. A reel is a pitch for attention. A selfie is a tiny negotiation over how much wealth, beauty, or fun to project. Because of this, the phone camera has become what the living room TV once was for RCA, a daily altar where family, friends, and strangers gather. Only now the broadcast tower sits in Meta's servers. But just as Polaroid misread digital sensors, and just as RCA underestimated cable and the internet, the next disruption to Meta's camera may not look like a camera at all. AR glasses that overlay filters directly onto the world. Decentralized networks, where images live on blockchains instead of corporate servers. Privacy-driven defaults, where photos auto-expire or never leave a local device. Each of these threatens the assumption that the newsfeed is the final destination for every image. Here, the rhyme becomes dangerous. Polaroid's money came from film. Every radical shift that reduced film sales felt like a threat to the core business. Meta's money comes from ads, anything that pulls attention away from scrollable feeds, from auctioned impressions and perfectly measured engagement, risks the same internal resistance. It's an example of what happens when a company's greatest engine of wealth quietly becomes its biggest blindfold. So when Meta talks about VR headsets, AR glasses, and presence, the real question is whether these are treated as the next camera or as expensive side projects safely kept from cannibalizing the ad machine. His